The Omoplata. Clark Gracie began training at 10 years old in his father's academy in San Francisco, and he trained with the adults because at that time there were no classes for children. He was the grandson of Carlos Gracie, who founded the art, and the son of Carly Gracie, who had brought it to the United States years before anyone in that country had heard of it. At 15, he went with his father to Rio de Janeiro and stayed there for some years before coming back to finish school. And by the time he received his black belt in his mid-20s from his father, he had arrived at a fairly uncomfortable position. He carried the most famous surname in martial arts into a sport that had long since stopped being impressed by it. He weighed about 82 kilos. He was not an athletic outlier. What he did instead was take one technique, a technique that most of his contemporaries regarded as a novelty, something you hit once a year against somebody careless, and go further into it than anybody had gone before. 20-odd years later, and 100 miles up the coast, a boy named Nolan Stuart started at 10 as well, as one of the founding members of the children's class at a school in Brea, California. His mother was Brazilian-American. His parents had separated when he was 6, and he spent his childhood summers on the family farm in Minas Gerais. His grandfather had fought Vale Tudo in Brazil in his youth, and in 2025, at a small invitational tournament of the 8 best grapplers in the world, he beat a 2-time world champion in the final, with the same technique. This is a story about that technique, and about what happened to it in between. Part 1. The move nobody trusted. Let us begin by describing the thing itself, carefully and slowly, because the argument depends on the details. The omoplata is a shoulder lock, applied with the legs. The name is Portuguese and refers to the shoulder blade. The mechanism is a rotation. The human shoulder is a ball and socket joint, which means it rotates very freely, considerably more freely than the elbow or the knee, but its freedom is not unlimited. If you take a person's arm, bend it at the elbow, and rotate the forearm downward toward their feet, the shoulder turns inward, and there comes a point where it will not turn further. Past that point, something must give. It is worth dwelling on why the shoulder behaves this way, because it explains why the technique is so effective when it lands, and so dangerous to train carelessly. Most joints in the body are hinges. The elbow opens and closes along one axis, and it has a hard mechanical stop at the end of its range. You can feel the bone arrive at the bone. An armbar works against that stop, and because the stop is unmistakable, the person being attacked knows precisely where they are in the range at all times. The shoulder has no such stop. It is a shallow socket, held together mostly by soft tissue, which is what allows it to travel through nearly a full sphere, and which also means the end of its range is not a wall, but a gradient. There is no bone arriving at bone to tell you that you have run out of room. The warning between comfort and damage is therefore short, and critically, the person being attacked often cannot judge how much room they have left. This is why shoulder locks feel different to receive. An armbar communicates its progress. An omoplata, applied by somebody who knows what they are doing, tends to arrive. Now, if you apply that rotation using your arms, the technique is called a kimura, and everyone knows it. If you apply the same rotation using your legs, it is an omoplata. The trade between the two is worth understanding properly, because it is not simply that one is stronger. The legs are several times stronger than the arms, so the omoplata can generate rotational force that no amount of arm strength can resist. Against a kimura, a very strong man can sometimes simply hold his arm in place. Against a correctly applied omoplata, he cannot, because the strength differential is not close. But the legs are also slower, far less precise, and much harder to reposition once committed. An arm can adjust its grip in 1/10 of a second. A leg cannot. And using the legs for this purpose requires you to place your entire body into a configuration that has consequences everywhere else, which is the source of every problem the technique has ever had. So, the kimura is a fast, precise, adjustable attack with a strength ceiling. The omoplata is a slow, coarse, committal attack with no strength ceiling at all. That is the trade, and every question about the position descends from it. To apply it from the guard, you must pass a leg over the opponent's arm. Turn your hips so that your body is roughly perpendicular to his, sit up, and rotate. And that sentence contains 3 distinct problems, each of which the sport took a very long time to solve. The first problem is construction time. An omoplata is not thrown, it is built. It takes several seconds to assemble, and during those seconds you are neither defending nor attacking. You are engaged in a partial commitment that has not yet become anything. A fast opponent who recognizes what is happening and attacks the construction will find you halfway between 2 positions, and in neither. The second problem is your base. To finish the technique, you must sit up and turn, which means abandoning the defensive structure of the guard. Your legs, which were between you and him, are now doing something else. And the third problem, the real one, the one that defined the technique's reputation for 40 years, is the roll. Here is why the roll is such a devastating defense. The omoplata rotates the opponent's shoulder in one direction. If the opponent turns his entire body in that same direction, tucking his head, rolling forward over the trapped shoulder, then the shoulder does not have to rotate at all, because the body is rotating with it. The lock unwinds. That is very nearly the perfect defense, and it has 2 further properties that make it worse. It is intuitive. People discover it without being taught, because the body naturally moves away from a rotational force. And it is fast. It takes about a second, whereas the attack took 5. So the arithmetic of the position historically was terrible. You spend 5 seconds building something, your opponent spends 1 second dismantling it. And when he does, you're sitting up with your legs out of position, and he is on top of you. That is why, for the better part of the 20th century, the omoplata was regarded as a flourish, a thing you saw in demonstrations, something you might hit against a beginner or against somebody who had stopped paying attention, but not a technique you built a competitive game around. Part 2, the missing laboratory. There is a historical reason for this, and it is not an accident of taste. Most of what became Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came out of judo, through Mitsuyo Maeda, who taught the Gracie family in Brazil in the early 20th century. Judo had by that point an enormously sophisticated competitive tradition, and techniques inside that tradition were refined at extraordinary speed because thousands of people were testing them against each other, under rules, constantly, for decades. But judo permits only one category of joint lock in competition: attacks on the elbow. Shoulder locks are not allowed. They never have been. The reasoning is medical and sound. The shoulder is a joint with a very large range and a poor sense of where its own limit is, which means the warning between discomfort and injury is short. The consequence, though, is that the omoplata, and every shoulder lock, spent something like 80 years without a competitive laboratory. Nobody was pressure testing it. Nobody was solving its problems, because in the only environment sophisticated enough to solve them, it was illegal. So it arrives in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in an underdeveloped state. The other techniques come with decades of refinement attached. This one comes as a rough idea, and it is worth widening this point out, because the omoplata is not the only thing this happened to. Every martial art that inherits from another inherits selectively, and what it inherits is shaped almost entirely by what the parent art's competition rules permitted. Judo's rules permitted throws, pins, strangles, and elbow locks, and so what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu received in the 1920s was an extraordinarily refined body of knowledge about throws, pins, strangles, and elbow locks, and something much closer to nothing about everything else. Leg locks are the other famous case. Judo restricted them heavily. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu then restricted them further, and for cultural reasons on top of the rules, they were regarded for decades as slightly dishonorable. The recourse of a competitor who could not pass a guard. The result was that a whole limb was effectively removed from the sport's field of study for 2 generations. And when it was finally reopened in the 2010s, the discoveries came so quickly and so densely that they reordered the entire competitive landscape inside about 5 years. The lesson is the same in both cases. The rules of a sport do not merely govern what happens in a match. Over decades, they determine what the participants are capable of thinking about. Because the only way anybody learns anything in a physical discipline is by trying it against a resisting opponent. And a rule that forbids the attempt forbids the knowledge. And when a rough idea meets a competitive environment, one of two things happens. Either somebody takes it seriously enough to solve it, or it becomes folklore, a thing everyone knows about, everyone can demonstrate on a compliant partner, and nobody uses when it matters. For a very long time, the Omoplata was folklore. Part 3, The Man with the Name. Clark Gracie's position within his own family is more interesting than a surname suggests. His father, Carly, was one of Carlos Gracie's sons, and he had gone to the United States in the 1970s, early, well before the family had any American profile whatsoever, and taught there for years to a country that had no idea what he was offering. It is difficult now to imagine how unpromising that must have felt. There was no market. There was no reason for an American in 1972 to want to learn to fight from his back, in a jacket, from a Brazilian, when every martial arts school in the country was teaching something that looked considerably more like the films. He taught military personnel at one point. He waited essentially for 2 decades for the world to become interested. And when it finally did, in the 1990s, when the family name became internationally famous almost overnight, that fame attached itself to a different branch, a different set of brothers, operating out of Southern California, with a considerably better instinct for publicity. Carly's 2 decades of groundwork were not much discussed. There were, in later years, legal disputes within the family about who was entitled to use the name commercially. And Carly was involved in them, and they were not pleasant. So Clark grew up inside the art, but noticeably to the side of its center of gravity. A Gracie, unmistakably, and yet not part of the branch that had become the brand. He trained in San Francisco with adults from the age of 10. He spent part of his adolescence in Rio. He came back, finished school, and eventually moved down to San Diego to train with the Revolution team under Rodrigo Medeiros, which is to say that he went, deliberately, outside the family, into a competitive room full of people who did not care what his surname was, because by the 2000s, the surname did not win matches. That is the correct frame for what he did next. A man carrying a legendary name in an era when the name had become a liability as much as an inheritance, with no physical advantage available to him, needing something that was his. He received his black belt from his father in the spring of 2010, and then he had to work out what he was going to do, because the honest assessment of Clark Gracie as a competitor at that moment was technically excellent, tactically sound, physically ordinary, in a division full of men who were none of those first 2 things, but were emphatically the fourth. What he did was specialize to a degree that most competitors would consider reckless. Part 4. How he solved the role. The insight is simple to state, and it changed the position's entire risk profile. If the role is the defense, and the role requires the opponent's body to rotate, then prevent the body from rotating, and the defense ceases to exist. Everything else follows from that. To roll forward over a trapped shoulder, a person needs to turn their far side over their near side. Their hips must come around. So if the far hip is anchored, held down, or held back by something, the rotation cannot begin. The trapped arm remains trapped, and now the opponent is in a position from which the intuitive escape simply does not function, and he must find a different one, under load, in real time. Gracie's version of this involved reaching across and controlling the far side of the body, rather than merely holding the near arm and anchoring himself heavily enough that the rotation could not start. The specific grips varied and are worth watching rather than reading about. The principle did not vary at all, and the consequence of solving the role is not that the omoplata becomes a better submission. The consequence is that it becomes a position. That distinction is the whole of this section, so let me put it a second way. A move is something you attempt. It has a duration, and at the end of that duration it has either worked or it has not, and if it has not, you have spent something to find out. A position is somewhere you are. It has no expiry. You can sit in it, adjust, wait, and try things, and the passage of time costs you nothing. Once the role is neutralized, the omoplata stops being a 5-second gamble and becomes somewhere you can live, and a technique you can hold indefinitely is a completely different object from a technique you can only attempt. There is a match of his at the Pan Championship in 2017 that illustrates it better than any explanation. He entered the omoplata early, and his opponent spent something close to 4 minutes trying to get out of it. Not 4 seconds, 4 minutes. And at the end of that, when the escape finally came, Gracie simply used the movement of it to take the man's back and finish from there. That is not a submission attempt. That is an occupation. His signature moment came a few years earlier in the final of the Pan Championship in 2013 at middleweight, where he finished Marcelo Mafra with the technique and won the title. A photograph from that match circulated very widely afterward, in the way that images sometimes do, and it did more for the Omoplata's public reputation than a decade of instructional videos. He was given a Submission of the Year award for it. People started calling the finish by his name. He is, it should be said, not a decorated champion by the standards of the very top of the sport. A Pan title at black belt, world medals, later Masters world titles. What he is, instead, is the man who rescued a technique, who took something the sport had written off and demonstrated, publicly and repeatedly, that the write-off had been wrong. That is a rarer contribution than a medal, and it lasts longer. Part 5, The Other Believers. He was not entirely alone, and it is worth naming the others, because a rehabilitation of this kind is never one person's work. Bernardo Faria, a very large man with an extremely narrow and extremely effective game built around the deep half guard and the over-under pass, won the open-weight division of the Pan Championship with an Omoplata around the turn of the 2010s. That is a significant data point, because the open weight is the division in which the size differences are largest and the technical margins are thinnest, and because Faria was in every respect a pragmatist. He did not play flashy positions. If Faria was finishing people with omoplatas, the technique was not a flourish. There were others in the women's divisions, where the position took hold earlier and more thoroughly than in the men's, for reasons that are probably to do with the strength differentials involved. A technique with no strength ceiling is worth more to a competitor who cannot rely on being the stronger person, and the women's game has historically been ahead of the men's on exactly those positions. But the pattern is what matters. Across roughly a decade, in scattered places, a handful of competitors independently arrived at the conclusion that the received wisdom about this technique was wrong. That is what precedes every reclassification in a young sport. Not one revelation, but several people quietly noticing the same thing at once. Part 6, The Node, which brings us to the second half of the story and to a different kind of mind. Nolan Stuart was born in California in 2002. His mother's family were Brazilian from Minas Gerais, and there was a farm there where he spent his summers as a boy, learning to work it and learning the language. His grandfather had been a vale-tudo fighter in Brazil in the years before any of this was a sport, which meant that unlike most American children, he grew up with the knowledge that this thing existed and that it belonged in some distant way to his family. His parents separated when he was 6, and he moved with his mother to Brea in Orange County. A jiu-jitsu school opened within walking distance of the house when he was 10, and he became one of the first children to enroll there under a coach named Dan Lukehart. He also, in middle school, started wrestling, deliberately, as an addition rather than a replacement, and continued through high school. That detail matters because it means he arrived at adult competition with something most guard players do not have, which is a genuine command of the standing position and of the pressure that comes with a wrestling base. There is a further detail in his lineage that is quietly telling. The instructional line running down to his coach passes through a series of names that are not household ones, and includes along the way a professional mixed martial artist. It is not one of the prestigious academy lineages. It is an ordinary American school in an ordinary Californian suburb, several generations removed from anybody famous. Which is the point. A generation earlier that would have been close to disqualifying. The assumption in the sport held for decades, and not without justification, was that the very top of the gi game would be Brazilian, trained in Brazil, in one of maybe 6 academies. A boy from Orange County learning at his local school was not going to beat those men in their own divisions. And then in 2025, he had the sort of year that reorders a career. He won the Pan Championship, he reached a world final at super heavyweight. And then he was invited to a tournament of 8, an invitational restricted to the very best grapplers in the world, with real prize money, which is a comparatively recent development in a sport that spent most of its history paying its champions nothing at all. His run through it is worth describing because it demonstrates the range rather than the specialism. In the opening round, he beat a highly regarded younger competitor comfortably on points, 8-2, which is a wrestling and pressure result rather than a guard result. In the second round, he faced a former world champion and won by unanimous referee decision, the first time he had beaten a black belt world champion in his career. And in the final, he met the reigning 2-time heavyweight world champion and finished him with the Omoplata. That combination, a points win, a decision, and a submission against 3 different kinds of opponent across one afternoon, is the profile of a complete competitor rather than a specialist, which is the difference between him and the man in the first half of this story, and it is not a criticism of either. Part 7, What Changed? Here's the difference between the two men, and it is not a difference of quality, it is a difference of category. For Clark Gracie, the Omoplata was a destination. You built it, you held it, you finished it, or you took the back off the escape. It was the best thing in his game, and the game was arranged to arrive there. For Stuart's generation, the Omoplata is not a destination, it is a junction. Think of it this way. In the older conception, techniques are things you collect. You learn 100 of them, and in a match you select from your inventory according to what presents itself. The better you are, the larger the inventory, and the faster the selection. In the newer conception, and this is the change that has swept through the whole sport across the last 15 years, techniques are not items in a list. They are nodes in a network, and the important knowledge is not the node, but the connections. What does this position lead to? What leads into it? When my opponent defends in this specific way, which position have I just been handed? Under that view, the value of a position is not how often it finishes. It is how many other positions it connects to. And the Omoplata, it turns out, is one of the most richly connected positions in the entire art. Consider what the opponent's available responses actually are, once the roll has been closed off. If he postures upward and drives to pull the arm free, he has straightened the limb and the finish is available. If he turns away from the pressure to face the mat, he has surrendered his back. If he steps around toward your head to relieve the angle, the arm is still wrapped and you attack again from the new position. If he drives his weight forward into you to flatten you out, he has committed his hips forward, and a committed hip is a sweep. If he manages to free the arm entirely, he has usually had to give you an angle and a leg to do it, and there is a whole family of leg entanglements that begin from exactly there. So the modern practitioner does not think of the Omoplata as an attack that might work. He thinks of it as a place from which every one of his opponent's options leads somewhere he already understands. That is the difference between a threat and a dilemma. A threat is a thing that might happen to you, and you can prevent it. A dilemma is a structure in which every available choice is bad, and your only decision is which kind of bad you would prefer. Part 8, Wedges and Spines. 2 further concepts, briefly, because they explain how the modern version is actually held. The first is the idea of a wedge. A wedge is a structure, a shin, a forearm, a hip, placed so that it physically blocks a movement rather than resisting it. The difference is enormous, and it is the difference between technique and effort. If I grip your arm hard, so you cannot pull it out, I am resisting, and resisting costs energy and eventually fails. If I place my shin across the space your arm would have to travel through, I am blocking, and blocking costs nothing because the structure does the work, and I am simply present. The modern Omoplata is held with wedges rather than with grips. That is why the men who play it now can maintain it for minutes at a time without visible strain, and why the older version, held with grips and effort, could not. The second is spinal alignment. This one is less intuitive and more important. Where a person can put their weight is determined by where their spine is pointing. A man whose head and shoulders are aligned over his hips can drive in any direction. A man whose head has been turned away from his hips, whose spine has been given a rotation it did not ask for, can drive in almost no direction at all, regardless of how strong he is. The omoplata, applied properly, does exactly this. It does not merely trap the arm. It takes the shoulder and rotates it across the center line, which turns the upper spine relative to the lower. And once that misalignment exists, the opponent's strength has largely been removed from the equation, not by overpowering it, but by disconnecting it from the ground. This is why a well-applied omoplata feels, to the person underneath it, less like being held and more like being unable to find anywhere to push from. And the third concept is the one that ties the position to the whole modern approach, the idea of the forced choice. In an older style of jiu-jitsu, you attacked and your opponent defended, and whether you succeeded depended on whether your attack was better than his defense. It was fundamentally a contest of quality, two people doing the same thing, one of them doing it better. The modern approach tries to remove quality from the equation wherever possible, and it does so by constructing situations in which the opponent must choose. Not situations where he must defend well, situations where he must select, and where every item on the menu is something you have already prepared for. This is a genuinely different theory of how to win. You are no longer trying to be better than the man in front of you at a particular thing. You are trying to arrange the geometry so that his skill is spent on choosing, rather than on executing, and so that the choice itself is the trap. The omoplata is the clearest single illustration of that theory in the whole art, which is why it has become such a favored teaching example. It presents 4 or 5 distinct escape routes, all of them reasonable, all of them the correct answer to some version of the problem, and every one of them delivers him somewhere worse. Part 9. What this says about the art. Step back from the technique, and there is a larger point here, and it is the actual reason this story is worth telling. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a very young art. It has been developing under serious competitive pressure for perhaps 60 years, which sounds like a long time and is not. Chess has had 600 and is still producing new ideas. In a young art, knowledge does not accumulate evenly. Some things get solved early because they are obvious, and everybody works on them. Other things get set aside, classified as low percentage, or flashy, or not worth the risk, and then simply sit there, unexamined for decades, because the classification becomes self-fulfilling. Nobody works on it because it does not work. It does not work because nobody works on it. The omoplata sat in that category for the better part of a century. It sat there partly because judo would not permit it, and partly because the one obvious defense to it had not been solved, and partly because the sport was still in the phase of collecting techniques, rather than connecting them. What rescued it was 2 things happening in sequence. First, somebody obsessive enough to specialize, to look at a technique everyone had written off and ask whether the write-off was actually correct. And then, a generation later, somebody systematic enough to place the rescued technique into a network and discover that it connected to nearly everything. That sequence, the specialist, then the systematizer, is roughly how every piece of knowledge in a young discipline gets recovered. It is how the leg locks came back. It is how half a dozen other positions currently sitting in the folklore category will eventually come back, once somebody decides to take them seriously. Which means that somewhere in the art right now, there is a technique that everyone knows about and nobody uses, sitting in exactly the place the omoplata sat in 1995, waiting. Coda, Clark Gracie still teaches, in San Diego, at an academy that carries his name. He still competes at master's level, and still wins. He is, in the long accounting, not the most decorated member of a very decorated family, but he is the one whose name is attached to a technique, which is a different sort of permanence, and arguably a better one. Medals belong to a year, a position belongs to whoever uses it, forever. Nolan Stuart is in his 20s, an American winning tournaments in Brazil, doing something that a generation ago would have been considered close to impossible, and it is far too early to say what his career will look like. And the technique itself will outlast both of them, because that is what techniques do. It began as a rough idea that judo would not test, and it was folklore for 80 years, and then a man with a famous surname and an ordinary body found the flaw in the folklore, and then a boy from Orange County who spent his summers on a farm in Minas Gerais, discovered that it was not a move at all, but a place where a great many things met. The shoulder still rotates the way it rotated in 1925. Nothing about the joint has changed. Everything about what we know how to do with it has.